Thank you. Thank you for this invitation to come and share with you some insights, some new developments, some principles, and some, I could say, probably directions which are interesting from two perspectives, and you can see that here on the first image. On the one hand, what we can talk about park planning and design, which is this fantastic image here of Prospect Park in New York. And the other hand, urban forestry, which is, you could say, a new angle or way of looking at what we're thinking about in terms of our cities and our challenges. And these two worlds are something which we're seeing coming together. And the question is actually, how do we go about that? How do we actually work with these two things? So I'm going to start with urban forestry. I'm going to start with this image from our colleagues and of my colleagues at the European Forest Institute, which is a beautiful image of the forest cover configuration of Europe and where we are now, of course, right through to the north. But there's something missing here, and a very important part of the world is missing here, or part of our green space. And that is the trees in our cities, the forests in our cities, the green spaces which also make up the forest. In the Netherlands, where I'm from, you can see there on the far top northwest part, forests, tree cover make up at least 10% of the land coverage, the land surface of the country. 10% of the forest. And this is probably a similar figure for other parts of Europe, but we're still not sure of that. But 10% is quite a bit, and certainly if you add that up, there are approximately 18 million trees in Dutch cities, and that's about one for every person who lives there. So this is quite a significant amount, and what it actually does, if you zoom into this part, this is an image of the western part of the Netherlands. Dennis just showed you some images of Rotterdam there to the southwest there. This is the western part of the country. Most of the trees are in the urban areas, and the non-urban areas are devoid of plantations, except for some parts which are natural forests. So this is what you call my research habitat. This is what I'm interested in. It's also where I'm based at the Technical University in Delft. The Faculty of Architecture. This is my team working on climate studies of trees, tree architecture and climate cooling by trees in urban spaces. We're also very much interested in what this urban forest is as a thing, as a system, and in terms of challenges like climate change. I don't do this on my own. I have a team of researchers. These are our fixed researchers and postdocs, but we also have PhDs. And we work with different people from the different cities. So we're working with Rotterdam at the moment, and The Hague, and Amsterdam as well on various projects. And we focus in urban forestry. We can say there are, in any case, from our perspective, we're trying to deepen and broaden understandings of what this thing is, this urban forest, what it actually is, particularly from the Dutch context. We're trying to integrate it more into built design and built environment disciplines, planning, architecture, and those kinds of things. Expand on the scientific foundations of urban forestry, and particularly develop new perspectives for designing biocities of the future. So we have a number of projects and clusters among which urban forest parks, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, which was doing some first exploratory research into. We do this because as built environment professionals, we're also busy with shaping cities. So we're not just developing fundamental knowledge, we're also making or developing knowledge and skills and applications for your world, our world, your cities. And these are the 5 angles we're looking at the moment from in Delft. Wooded commons, the social perspective of the urban forest. The urban forest as a climate arboretum. The urban forest as a novel ecosystem. A forest regiopolis. and perhaps even towards the far future, a completely timbered city. So these are kind of frames, and I'm going to talk about the climate arboretum angle, if you like, the realm, but the others are important too. Maybe something we all know, but probably just important to touch again on what are we dealing with, just to really zoom out. We have a number of challenges which are about climate change, not just heating, but extreme weather events, salinification of sedimentation in our oceans. We have changes to the biosphere, and of course, the problems with biodiversity, the dangers to biodiversity, and all kinds of other related problems. And it's not just an ethical problem we have. It's not just something, well, let's care about our planet more. It's also a very costly problem. And if we don't deal with it, we can see here on the right the graphic developed by the United Nations to just in the last 20 years, which extreme weather events, such as drought, flooding, but tropical cyclones, and the impact they've had, the size of them, the impact they're having in terms of their financial implications of fixing them up. So we better get our act together, otherwise it's going to also cost us quite a bit of money. Now, the built environment is a specifically problem within those larger problems. So we have there are mitigation things we're dealing with, there are those kinds of education things, but we have an adaptation problem in our environment particularly. Of course, we can mitigate things as well, so our parks and our forests also mitigate climate change, so they mitigate the output, they capture carbon, for instance, but the real aspect, the real challenge is adapting our environments and educating our citizens about climate change. So we see here there are a number of major drivers of climate change and a whole plethora of impacts in the built environment, which are lots of those sort of angry little colourful bubbles around us. And we can see that within that, urban green infrastructure, this concept of urban green infrastructure, is becoming more and more important as a way to really tackle a lot of these problems. So we've seen in projects, we've just seen in the last two presentations, which deal with blue-green infrastructures and solving those problems, heating, dealing with extreme weather events like water, and also those kinds of bigger biodiversity problems which we can tackle. So let's look back at the urban forest again. What are we talking about? And in terms of urban green infrastructure, we can say that the urban forest, the trees, the three-dimensional green, if you like, the wooded vegetation of our cities is like the backbone. I often, with my students, tell them about Charles Darwin's depiction of the kelp forests in the shallow seas. Those kelp forests are actually the kind of, you could call it the infrastructure, the backbone of all the life in the shallow seas. And in the same way, urban forests, the trees in cities are the backbone of that green, that urban green infrastructure. So here we see an image of Delft, which we're doing some studies on. This is the city where, luckily, a small city where our university is based, and this is an image of the different scales of the urban forest. At a system level, but also at a tree level across the city. And to the right here, this is the major, let's call them perspectives or aims, principles we need to be looking at. The 330-300 rule, which is a very broad-brushed, but in the meantime fairly scientifically based perspective. 3 trees from the view of each window, or each of our houses to have 3 trees which we can look at, or three green species, elements. 30% canopy cover, so 30% of the city being covered by trees, a wooded species, vegetation, and 300 meters to the closest park for each resident. And particularly these last two, the 30% rule, is a very important one, and that's really an important aspect for urban parks. If we've established that if we achieve 30% tree coverage in cities, we can keep them resilient to most effects of climate change. And if we can manage to reach different parts of the city within 300 meters, we can also keep our residents, our communities resilient. So if we look at this scale of urban forestry, we try and understand the different dimensions of the urban forest: spatial, ecological, environmental, human, social, cultural, and economic. Then the park and urban parks sit within the scale of the feature level. And so this is a core issue. Not just so there's a tree scale, there's a feature scale, there's an area scale, and there's a territory system scale. And the scale, the urban park is a very important feature scale. It's very important because we're seeing that with densification of cities, we're losing trees on private lands. So public trees are the place where we can still expand on the number of trees we have and our tree cover. And what is that? The effects of that are now getting more and more clearer. Colleagues have been looking recently in New York. What if we increase this 30% coverage of trees? What effect that might have, for instance, in the New York City area on heat vulnerability and on cardiac arrest and all those heat-related problems. And it's a very interesting study. On the left, we see where it's possibly could be increased or could be increased at all levels, and where that corresponds to the vulnerability index. And that doesn't always correspond, but it often does to where it's happening. But this is a very quantitative approach. So this is like, okay, let's do it. But how do we actually do it? For our urban parks, this has at least one particular impact. That is a 30% increase in the tree canopy in all of our urban parks. So this is, we can translate this 30% directly to all of our urban parks, pretty much across the board, across the world, which is a fairly dramatic perspective, but it also gives us the chance to rethink our urban parks in terms of renewing what we're talking about in terms of planting design, but also species selection, the way we're planting, how we might think about our soil and water design, which, to be honest, hasn't always been thought of in our first parks, initial parks, existing parks. Rethink our maintenance regimes, and perhaps also even our management practices, which Paul mentioned and talked about a lot already. So this is what we're talking about, and these are not just, you could say, not just problems, challenges, but look at them also as opportunities. Opportunities to rethink what we're actually doing with our parks and repositioning them in the kind of forefront of the battle with climate change. Okay, so but to do this, it's important as park professionals and planners to understand that you can't just, it's not just across the board everywhere. We luckily don't have to solve all the problems everywhere. And this is an interesting tool, the Climatope tool, which allows designers and planners to establish what's the climate problem in my park, in and around my park. So it could be that you only have to solve water and some parts of the heating problem, which we saw in Rotterdam. Dennis showed it. And other places we might have a biodiversity problem, etc. But a Climatope a map will show you what the problem is. But the real challenge is harking into the things that we just saw mentioned by both Paul and Dennis, is actually these beautiful parks and what we have. And how to actually marry this unique and established and very wonderful creation, which we call the urban park, with this fairly, if I might say so, urgent, quantitative, across the board, sort of top-down, generic problem of urban forest and increasing canopy cover. And how do you bring those two together? And that's a real challenge. And the challenge lies to begin with in understanding what parks actually are. And luckily I don't have to tell too much about this because Paul's gone into it quite a bit. Again, Birkenhead as an important one, but it's important to remember that parks are not just urban forests, but they are this massively beautiful creation of social, of environmental, of cultural, of urbanistic aspects, which have to do with civic life, which have to do with cooling, has to do with experiences of nature, and has also to do with shaping the city. So in some of our studies we've done, we can see what a park like Birkenhead actually does in terms of telling the story of nature. These are the different natural stories in Birkenhead Park, and the way actually movement and experience is so important in parks and should be continued on. They are also the last bastion of you could say, our sort of interaction. They're democratic places. It's the place where we all get together and have interactions with each other from the 1840s and still to this present day. And those interactions aren't necessarily fun always, but the reason we're all together is that we also have to discuss our differences and our problems with each other also at some point. So it's not about you could say the park is still the place where we all get together and almost a democratic arena for discussion and even if you don't like your neighbors, you still go to the park because you have to get on with each other. Yeah? So and one of the things I really love is that during the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we had a discussion in the Netherlands, and for a week long on all of the channels, we had public discussions on TV about what democracy, and the background was an urban park. That was the background. So the democratic heart of our cities, of our cultures, of mankind is the urban park. That's a fairly moving thing for me, and it's very important. But we still have to remember that as a very, very important part of what you do. So you're sociologists, you're cultural geographers as park designers, and you still will be. And this story about experience and about nature, this is the basics of what we're talking about when we talk about design. So now I want to get to the tree design bit of it, because it's not just a forest. It's not just an urban forest. Our park is a composition of vegetation and a lot of other things. Here we see the transition from the pictorial landscape garden to the scenographic urban park, which is a beautiful sort of transition from one style to the other, but in fact still drives what we're doing. And take note of that last image to the bottom right here. This is what trees are. This is not a forest as we know it. It's a hybrid kind of forest, and it's very important. It's the cornerstone of our experience of parks. And one of still my favorite, I would say, if I could be that bold, Paul, Birkenhead was a good start, but Buurtschemont was the perfectionism of Birkenhead. This is really where that whole, let's call it kind of genre, all of those things, the social, the experiential, the vegetative, all come together and still come. This is the heart and soul of this part of Paris. And we can see here this human experience, understanding human experience by a series of lines and walking beneath trees is the cornerstone of the vegetation design. Views to the city, narratives about nature, discussing with each other, that's what's actually happening and still happens today in a good urban park. And these images which seem quite, let's call it sort of forest-like, are actually very highly composed woodland designs using specific trees to create a landscape, and this is my favorite of Olmsted's. Central Park is great, but Prospect Park is brilliant. It really is fantastic. And we can see here also this main frame of trees. So we are talking about a forest, but it's a cultural woodland. It's a woodland, and it's a composed woodland. Each of those trees and shrubs and the grass and topography has been placed in a certain kind of way. So the tree, this park genre has developed, as we've seen, Paul's shown it. I call it the diaspora, the 2.0 you call it. Cologne here, fantastic example. Park networks, pocket parks, forest parks, peripheral parks, and even brownfield parks, the subject of my PhD. the post-industrial parks, which are now scattered all through the world. Many, many parks, many, many flavors of parks. But each of them build still on this, the good ones, the ones that really function well, build on this composition thing. So I want to finish with this, what this composition is about. To begin with, it's the tree level. So understanding what the trees are, their beauty, their shape, the way we experience them and walk beneath them. It's not a thing itself, it's something that we interact with. And there are so many beautiful, beautiful trees, so many beautiful forms of them. And this is something which we can see in each and every park as being the cornerstone, the basics. Which tree, what's its architecture, what is it saying to us, and what is it as a thing. If we look at an examples like the Gijsberg van Amstel Park in Amsterdam, we can see lots of these trees, and each of them has a very specific expression, a very specific form, a very specific interrelationship with us and what we do with it. We've developed a tree architecture system, a typology you could call it, for understanding crown, wood and foliage patterns, and understanding what that actually means in terms of cooling, but also in terms of experience. At the next level, we have the arrangement scale. So parks are arrangements of trees and shrubs. And this is not just something of a copy of nature, it's actually a unique new kind of composition. And each of those parks has various arrangements at different kinds of scales with various experiential aspects to it. And this builds on a whole understanding of the architecture of the arrangement. So what's actually happening in terms of the spatiality of what's it doing. This is a 20th century, you could call it, contribution from our modernist forebears like Rose and also Dan Carley, etc., looking at what trees and tree-arranged woody species actually do and how we can shape spaces and shape experiences with that. So we've developed further on those, and this is just for the parks in Delft. We've looked at the points, lines, planes, and volumes that we can come across. So it's already a kind of mix and match of all those different arrangements in a park to create a new composition. And then if you zoom back out right to the whole park scale, we can see that there's a composition of those arrangements all together to make that whole experience. So we're seeing this wooded architecture. It's a large building we're walking through, but it's natural, it's growing, it's developing, it's biotic, it's biodiverse, it's doing all these kinds of things. But it is a human space, a human creation, a large garden. So these three scales we've also analysed for Delft and looked at all of the different configurations from the tree scale through to the configuration scale, through to the whole area scale where we see the parks in. So I want to finish with some conclusions and recommendations. To begin with, you could say parks are essential in adapting cities to climate change, particularly thermal, but also hydrological and ecological challenges. They're evident. It's a low-hanging fruit. It's what we need to do because you can do it quite quickly. So we need to do that quickly. It's about tree canopy and it's about volume, but it's also about looking at tree selection, planting techniques, soil and water, and also the maintenance and management regimes. But they need to happen within that tradition and that praxis of planning and design. It's important to know what the problem is, which climate problem we've got, where. So look beyond the park. You're an urbanist, you're a sociologist, but you're a climatologist of the region, and even the whole context. And also know the physical and the cultural and the historical context of the park. At the same time, it's still a social, environmental, and ecological place, and the neighbourhood is always important. And lastly, this is the most important. I want to leave with you that trees are and remain the main frame of urban parks, trees and vegetation. That human experience has and does and can still drive designs for any urban park. So this is what they are. And interestingly enough, we think, if we ask an ecologist or a forester, they'll say, no, we need to make this more biodiverse, or no, we need to make this more environmental. But remember that most of the parks we did by chance, but also perhaps by design, are still actually quite biodiverse and quite cool. So it's not that they're not doing that at the moment, but they can do it better. There are three scales which I talked about, and understanding those spatial scales is really central to what you need to do to get that 30% extra with it. And movement, to finish with, is what we do. We move, and to move is the essence of any landscape architecture project, and also the essence of a park. Thank you.